Dr. Naylor is a native of Australia. He began his tenure at the museum about 7 years ago. He possesses more than 30 years of leadership in the nonprofit arena. Under Naylor's leadership, the museum memorial has achieved unprecedented success, breaking records for attendance each of the first 5 full years, 2014 through 18, as well as setting records for educational and community event participation, website traffic, social media, and media impressions and digital learning. Their website is great. I heard today that they're in the midst of putting together a new website. I actually hadn't visited it until this morning. And there's so much good information there. If you're just interested in that stuff, you're a history buff, go look at it. If you have students who are studying, there is lots of good factual information there. During Dr. Naylor's tenure, the museum and memorial has been profiled by media outlets around the world and has generated more than 10 billion earned media impressions. He earned a PhD from Curtin University in Perth, Australia. That's on the southwestern corner of Australia. He serves on the boards and committees for several civic and educational initiatives, including the Kansas City Economic Development Corporation Advocacy Council and the board of the Institute for Sustainable Philanthropy. Welcome, Dr. Naylor. Apologies for technical difficulties. Or more just technical lack of preparedness on my part.
There we go.
Well, good afternoon.
Good afternoon.
I'm Matt Naylor, and I'm really pleased to be able to visit with you. It's my first gig since the middle of March. lunch. So it's nice to be out of the office with a group of folks again. So I'm just really delighted. So what I want to do is to talk a little about the museum, and then to talk a little about the impact of the pandemic on us, and then what we've got planned coming up. And you should feel free to ask questions along the way. We'll provide a bit of time toward the end, but you might find it more satisfying to let me know if you've got questions along the way, and either I can put you off till the end, or we can address it right then and there. So let me tell you a little about the Museum and Memorial. You know, it really is a local story of grassroots initiative, which differentiates the museum and memorial from other like institutions around the world. It was soon after the armistice of 1918 that a group of civic leaders came together and said, let us do something to create a tribute for peace and to honour the dead of the region. And then in 19, there was a grassroots fundraising effort that about 83,000 people participated in. Well, I'm thinking it's really probably more like 83,000 households. And in Kansas City at that time was about 250,000 people. So, you know, this is an extraordinary outpouring of community support. Which then, you can see this photograph here is from 1921 when the 5 Allied commanders from Belgium, France, Italy, the United Kingdom, and the United States came to Kansas City for the first time ever that they had been together despite being allies. And then they were here for the dedication. They then went on to Washington, D.C. to dedicate the Tomb of the Unknown Soldier. So a significant moment for Kansas City. That's in 21, the construction begins here opposite Union Station, which had been opened in 1914. And then in 1926, President Coolidge came. He was here as Vice President in 21. He came back in 26. And 150,000 people gathered for that event. So it's sort of like a Chiefs rally, or the Royals parade. But in 1926, that's a big deal. You know, a lot of people coming out to see the president, and to dedicate then one of what was about 10,000 memorials around the country. I'll comment about that again in a moment. So dedicated in 26, so you can see there as part of the crowd. That's from the south side looking north up the mall. Now it's much all full of trees and it's very picturesque. And then in the late 80s, early 90s, there were some deferred maintenance issues that caught up, as it did with many civic buildings around that time, and was needed to be closed. And so again, the people of the region rallied around and raised about $100 million by a one-time 18-month sales tax and private philanthropy. And then that resulted then in the restoration of the memorial, and in its understructure, the building of a new museum. In the part of the original, the memorial, the tower, the 2 buildings, we always had what was called the Liberty Memorial Museum. So we began collecting in 1920, second oldest collecting institution in the world of all one archives. But what you see today is much more lavish than what you would have seen in 1926. And so, you know, part of this and part of the restoration, they discovered that the understructure of the tower was really compromised and it was at risk of falling down. And that's true of the other buildings. And so even as it was being built, this was not a piece of artillery that was found during the excavation. Although, you know, that happens in France every day. It's going to take 500 years, they say, for the iron harvest to be really fully collected. It sort of looks like it, doesn't it? That was discovered. But rather, it was placed there as part of the process. So in order to be able to get some of the large objects in the museum, they had to be placed there before it was built and then moved around as the foundations were poured and so forth.
Really?
And then in 2006, the museum that you see today was opened. 2 really important designations occurred. In 2004, in a bicameral, bipartisan bill, the Congress designated the museum as the National Museum. And then in 2014, in a bicameral bipartisan bill, the Congress designated the memorial as the National World War I Memorial. And currently there is no World War I memorial in the nation's capital, unlike all other major conflicts of the 20th century. There will be one in Pershing Park, which is off the mall, near the Willard Hotel, near the White House. And that will be, some of that will be completed later this year. I'm a commissioner of the World War I Centennial Commission has been involved in that. So we received the designation, all the glory and no money from the feds. Not a bad thing necessarily, because when there's a shutdown, we've had people come and protest the government shutdown, so we have to run out and say, no, we're still open, it's okay. But it certainly is significant that here in Kansas City, as a result of the work of the people of the region in building a monument of scale, that it, by virtue of more than 600,000 people a year gathering there, has become by default, it became by default the nation's national memorial, which was then recognized and given the designation by Congress. And I think that that's an extraordinary achievement for the people of the region to be the stewards of the American experience of World War I. And then, of course, we also collect encyclopedically, which further differentiates us from other like institutions around the world, because we tell the global story rather than just the American story, as most nations focus just on their own country or their own empire. In fact, some would argue if you went to the Imperial War Museum in London, which is a wonderful museum, and you were in the World War I galleries, you'd wonder who else but the Brits were in the war. I think that we do a fine job in being able to tell a more comprehensive story. Part of the commitment of our forebears to collect encyclopedically, and then of those who were involved in the early 2000s when the new museum was put together. Alrighty, so of course this is what you see today. It's really quite an extraordinary sight, isn't it? Quite fantastic. Every city has a great opera and a symphony and a ballet very often, and art galleries, but we're fortunate that only one city in the world has the National World War I Museum and Memorial, and we, of course, share the responsibility as being stewards of that. So some pictures of the galleries, there's some photographs here of the propaganda or public relations posters that you found, early. Modern PR was birthed in World War I, and here's a fantastic examples of that. And then what many people enjoy is the Sunderland Bridge, the glass bridge over the poppy field, 9,000 looms, each representing 1,000 combatant deaths from all of the belligerents, so from all of those participating. Now more than 100 nations, if it was in today's terms, were killed. I'll just skip back, and we have lots of events, so we used to have lots of events, and we will again on that glass bridge. It really is quite a fantastic sight. And then as you look up, the memorial is above you, so it's really a beautiful connection between the memorialization of the war dead and the soaring tower above, which is a very much a 19th century notion of the hope resident in death. And much of the great frieze on the north side speaks of war's horror and the anticipated future of prosperity and peace. So we really carry those two elements, I think, in wonderful balance. And then we have a wonderful auditorium where there are many, many activities in as well. Steeply ranked, but with really big plush seats. Alright, so one of the responsibilities that we had during the commemorative period, which is the 100th anniversary of the war, 2014 through 2018, was to help the United States commemorate this founding catastrophe of the 20th century, the war which really did reshape the United States' role in the world. You really can't think of the American century without understanding that it was birthed by the US stepping onto the world stage in World War I. So the role that the Kansas City played, the National War Museum and Memorial played in that commemoration was really significant. And it really significantly increased the profile of the organisation nationally and internationally. Just yesterday we had on a media call, CBS Sunday Morning, CNN, Fox News, the Washington Post. You know, 6 years ago, we'd be beside ourselves, knowing that these national media outlets would be wanting to talk to us. Now it's a weekly occurrence that that national outlets, you know, right from on the one hand CBS Sunday Morning to a 45-minute radio interview with Breitbart Radio, you know, on the other end of the political spectrum, right across. It's really an exciting thing, and largely because of the role we played in the commemorative period. So part of our challenge, and for those of you who, all of you are involved in business leadership, but the challenge that I had with my board was to say, how do we define ourselves post-commemoration? We can't just rest on what we were doing during the commemorative period and say that's who we are, because that's gone. And so I have to be able to articulate a compelling future post-commemoration. So we went through a whole lot of iterations over about almost a 2-year period with many stakeholders helping us think about how do we do our work after the commemorative period? How do we build on the momentum and capture the moment? So we see that how do we keep the war and its enduring impact at the forefront? How do we learn and share from new scholarship? How do we capitalise on the growth of people's interest in the experience of World War I? What are we going to do in order to be able to build a museum and memorials growing profile? So it's a business question that many of you would be dealing with. How do we continue the growth? How do we articulate the vision? What can we do which is audacious and engages our stakeholders? All this sort of thing. So we did a tremendous amount of really exciting work, and we're really poised to begin to launch what I'm going to talk about in a few moments, and then lo and behold, another bloody pandemic. So, you know, in 1890 we had the pandemic, which killed about 650,000 Americans, more than 10 times the number of Americans that were killed in battle in World War I. Sometimes called the Spanish flu, not because it originated in Spain, but because the Spanish newspapers were not censored and they reported on the pandemic before others. And so it got its name colloquially called the Spanish flu, but really originates in Kansas. And about 600, so altogether 117,000 Americans killed in the war, half of whom were killed from the flu. So it had terrible impact, maybe as many as 50 million people across the globe. And so here we are about 100 years later, and lo and behold, we're hit by the flu again. And with, of course, potential consequences as equally as dramatic as what did happen during those days. So we were watching this in February, thinking we're seeing what's happening around the world, we're seeing it creep into the West Coast. What are we going to do if it impacts us? And we began to do a bunch of work. And then, of course, you know that in Kansas City, at least, the mayor closed things up about the 15th of March was when all that happened. So we closed, or it must have been, I must have my date wrong. I must have more like the 16th rather than the 24th. We closed for that period from the middle of March until the middle of June. And so in the month leading up to, we began to examine what our financial modelling was and how it would be impacted. We're reliant on about 50% of our revenues on gate take, on tickets sold, events, cafe, bookstore, earned income. So we generate about half of our revenue from earned income sources, and we've really grown that over a number of years and had a really stable financial footing for us. And so we began to look at what would be the impact if we closed for 6 weeks, 10 weeks, what would it mean for us to have no revenue coming in? And some of our board members are saying, man, it's going to go longer than what you think. And then when we do open, it's going to be 12 months. Some of the museums in New York were saying it's going to be 4 years before we return to previous visitation levels. So how are we going to manage through that and so forth. So we created financial plans to deal with that. And then I tasked the staff with saying, if we had to work from home, what can we do? What are the things, what are the priorities that we have? So they then began to do some work thinking about projects that we could be involved in, and I'll make comments about that in a moment. And so we have on one hand us examining a financial plan, on the other hand saying, are there things that we can do? So for the bean counters amongst us, if you have any questions about that, I'd be happy to talk about the application of restricted funds, of previous year's earnings and so forth, and how we manage that. But in summary, instead I'll say we established 5 teams across the organisation. So some of these groups work together, but many of them, these are groups of people who would otherwise not be working together. And so, for example, you consider building an essential infrastructure, security, maintenance, and so forth. Those folks already work together. Digitization and transcription, that's right across the organisation. Digital learning, similarly across the organisation. Stakeholder engagement across the organisation. And support services, that's finance, HR, and so forth. And each were assigned a leader, and then they all worked from home, and we didn't lay anybody off. So we were able to figure a financial model that retained everybody and kept us focusing on mission focused activities. As a result of this, it's been surprisingly refreshing and stimulating for the staff. For example, the digitization and transcription team, what their focus was taking scanned letters of US soldiers and their families that they had written to one another during the war, and they were scanned. We already have many of them available on the website, but there were many more which were scanned in the month leading up to the shutdown. And they were transcribed into text form at home by staff. And what did we do with that? Well, then we take those Word files, we put them on the website together with the long form scanned documents, and then people are able to run those through translation programs like Google Translate, and they can have it read back in German or Japanese, whatever. And for persons, for example, who have learning differences or might be sight impaired, they can be used in different ways, but for sight impaired people, they can be read back to them. Whereas in the scanned long form, they're useless. So all of this was a spectacular project to make content available to people all over the world, accessible, which is wonderful. And for our staff, for many of them, for example, guest service staff, store staff, ticketing staff who are now doing this, it drew them into the archives in a way which was enormously satisfying for a while. They got to read these letters, and it was so fantastic. So, and then I won't talk about the other projects, but really extraordinary. And we will have digitized 10,000 documents by the end of this year. The NEH saw this, they read about it in the New York Times, in the Washington Post, Time Magazine, CNN picked up on it. We were not seeking the PR, but hey, we'll take it. It resulted in some restricted gifts, some grants to help us. So it really was mission focused, doing what we ought to do, and also generated revenue unexpectedly to help us through. So that's been an interesting project for us, and a way that we've been able to navigate. Then we opened on the 2nd of June with all sorts of protocols in place. So let me just comment about the impact that this has had. I mean, financially, it's just, well, we have a pass through, but it's like it is for many of you. It's been, had a profoundly negative financial impact for us. We were fortunate that the last 7 years we've been building some cash. So inside talk here, when I started with the organisation, we had 14 days of unrestricted cash on hand, and we began 2020 with 156 days of unrestricted cash on hand, which means that we've got a buffer that we're willing, working with the board, to eat into in order to help us get through. So, sort of part of that is, well, it's working capital, but it's also a bit of a rainy day fund. So we will be eating into some of that. So the impact on, this is 2012 attendance. Don't worry so much about what the numbers are, but it's from the period, the beginning of June to the end of August. This is 2019, we've grown by 60% our visitorship, and then this is 2020. So you can see that we're way down, all the headway that we've been making. But what's exciting in that is that we've really got a stable visitorship through this period. So that's encouraging. It allows us to project out perhaps next 6 to 12 months to see how we're going to manage through the pandemic and such. All right. So back to then, what's the compelling future for us? We see that the pandemic is enormously instructive for us. We are learning a lot from this, and it will inform us very positively and create new opportunities for us. And these three big ideas that we'd already declared last August have even deeper resonance now in the midst of the pandemic. What are those? And I'll briefly review these and then we'll do some Q&A. The first is we'll create a richer, more immersive visitor experience by refreshing and expanding the galleries and access to the Museum and Memorials collection. So we want to create a richer experience in what already is in the top 25 museums in the world per TripAdvisor. And has been the #1 attraction for Kansas City on TripAdvisor for the last 10 years. We want to create a richer, more immersive gallery experience. Secondly, we want to ensure that the stories of minorities, of women, of Indigenous people who served in World War I from across the world are not lost but are remembered through a dedicated collecting initiative. And I'm going to expand on these just briefly in a moment. Thirdly, we want to make the museum more accessible to audience across the globe through effective use of digital learning technologies. I'm going to make some mention about that. Okay, so there are 12 key enhancements. This is one. On the research level of the Museum and Memorial, we have several levels. At the lower level, we're going to create a new 4,000 square foot open storage and educational area, which will allow us to be able to have thousands more objects available for people to see, but you also can see the archival and collections team working behind. So it's a working space that you can see, as well as educational nooks like you see there. So this would be an example of the sort of space that we're envisaging. 4,000 square feet is a lot, or 190 feet of coastline is another way of saying it. So another enhancement we're going to create is what we're calling Meet the Participants. And we're going to take out a portion of our main galleries and we're going to create this area where there will be 5 experiences for you to interact with a participant in the wall. Now, on one end it'll be a video, the other end it might be a hologram that you can actually interrogate. So we're not settled on the technology yet. But the idea being that you can come and engage with 5 participants, maybe a nurse, perhaps an American soldier, maybe an African American soldier, perhaps a French child. Maybe every 6 months we can change those out. So in any year there are 10 stories being told, or once a quarter we can do it with 20. So when you come back, you're going to be experiencing a different group of participants that you're going to be interrogating and learning about their personal experience in the war. And then lastly, we want to take Memory Hall and in 2025 open a whole new exhibition, permanent installation that tells the story of the Museum and Memorial. About 65% of the visitorship comes from outside of the region, and the #1 question is, why are you here? And we think there's a wonderful local story that speaks to the values of the Midwest and the very best of American civic life that can be told as the story of the Museum and Memorial. And so we're going to be launching that and ready for the 100th anniversary of the dedication of the memorial in 2026. All right, secondly, stories of minorities, black soldiers, for example, Native American soldiers, women and indigenous people who served. We want to ensure that they're preserved. We already have the world's most comprehensive collection, more than 300,000 objects, and we're committed that all stories be told. Our work is about memory and learning, and it's already a differentiator. We already tell stories from across the globe. And so let's do more of that, so that it makes even more reason for people to come to the region, spend their money here, and learn by visiting the museum and memorial. So we say that's already a differentiator, let's build on it. And importantly, we want to ensure that the stories from the margins are being told. Very often they're told through the dominant voices, the principal powers in the war, and maybe some colonies like New Zealand, Australia, and so on. But as I mentioned earlier, there are as many as 115 countries who participated. Let's tell those stories and ensure that those objects and artifacts are preserved. And we think this is a real drive for Kansas City. And then thirdly, access to the 4 billion people who already have internet access. How can we take the museum and memorial to them? In the school year, the 18-19 school year, we served more than 14 million students directly. That's not a made-up number. That's an audited number of students that we served. We more than 10 million minutes were watched on our YouTube channel in the months of March, April, May. Of this year, we were averaging 1.5 million minutes a month of people consuming content from our video channel, more than almost 1.5 million page views and unique visitors, more than 500,000 unique visitors to the website each year, which just demonstrates there's tremendous growth opportunity here for us, that we want to take our content to the world. So how do we do that? Digitize the collection, make it available to everybody, create a user-friendly collections database. We're currently migrating that now. And then educational curation on YouTube. We want to be able, at the moment, you go to the website, then you go to the YouTube channel. We want to be able to curate content in the website for varied and many audiences. We think it's a huge growth opportunity. And then ongoing servicing of teachers through curriculum content. We've been doing workshops right across the country. In fact, the shutdowns enabled us, instead of taking a team to each state to do it, we're able to do it now virtually and have very large audiences of teachers who are wanting to learn how do I teach World War I, because it's a right area of instruction. And so there's some tremendous opportunities. Okay, my key ideas then. Create a richer experience for our visitors. I want people in 10 years' time still saying that's the best museum experience I've ever had. And my fantasy is to be on firstly it's to be on an airplane again, but after we're all on airplanes again, is to be on a flight and someone says, so where are you from? And I'll say Kansas City, and they'll say, isn't that the home of the National World War I Museum Memorial? And I'll know that because they visited and it's such a rich visitor experience. Secondly, strengthen the world's most diverse collection and ensure that the stories from the margins are told. Thirdly, take the museum and memorial global through this digital strategy, adapt to a changing world, which is part of our response to the pandemic. And then lastly, be the front porch of Kansas City, the place where people gather when we want to celebrate is on the North Lawn, the place where you go, many families, to have their senior photographs or their wedding photographs, or they bring their friends from out of town to, is the deck at the National War I Museum Memorial to take in these iconic views looking toward the Northland. And so we see ourselves as being that front porch and have a responsibility of doing that. So we remain committed to our work of being America's leading institution dedicated to remembering, interpreting, and understanding the Great War and its enduring impact. So, what questions might we have in the remaining minutes that we have? Yes?
I have a question. You mentioned the London Museum and some of the bias. Do the countries that lost the war have museums?
Yeah.
And if so, have you been to them? And what
So,
do they look like?
Christopher Clark is an Australian academic who is in the UK, is the most prestigious chair in history in the Commonwealth regions at Cambridge. And he tells me the story of being in Germany, having written this book called Sleepwalker, which was a very important, thick academic text. In the first few months, he sold 500,000 copies of, and he's in Germany. And two little stories. He is the Minister of Defence, says he wants an audience with Chris. So they go there, he's got his little entourage, he goes in there with the Minister of the Entourage, it's like the Secretary of State, it would be the library in the US. So she dismisses them all and sits down with Christopher. And this is the beginning of the commemorative period. And she says, Christopher, what am I to say? So her question was, how do we do this? What should the Germans be saying about the war? So the German museums have really struggled with what to do, what to say. Most other, the Europeans, the Belgian, the French, the Italians, the Brits, it absolutely, and then Australians, New Zealanders, the last 4 years have been all-consuming for them. It has dominated the narrative. Extraordinary. One of the most moving experiences was, you might have seen the installation of poppies at the Tower of London. Now, this is an artist who came to the Imperial War Museum and to their little arts commission and said, I've got this idea, I want to make 880,000 poppies and install them. And they said, okay, let's do that at the end of the commemorative period for the armistice. And he said, no, it needs to be at the beginning. So they persuaded. So they installed this red sea of ceramic poppies, and then they read all 880,000 names. And it was absolutely extraordinary. Absolutely captured the imagination. So the Allies, and of course in France, everywhere you went, there's barely an area that's not, by 1916, 1/3 of men aged between 18 and 30 were dead in France. The impact it had on France was just so extraordinary. So all over. So, but the Germans, others struggled with it a lot more than did the Allies. And so lots of, parochial stories told, not a lot of global story being told. We're really one of the few. And we have a tremendous number of public programs. It's very broad in our public programming and global in its focus.
Congratulations on all that free cash flow.
Yeah.
How are you going to pay for the physical enhancements to the
Sure.
facility?
So we believe that there are people of goodwill right across the country who want to be a part of the upgrades to the galleries, and it's got a pretty hefty price tag. We work with Applebaum Associates. They're our original designers. They do the Holocaust Museum, the NASCAR Hall of Fame. They're doing the Imperial War Museum of World War II. They're doing the new reinstallation at the Air and Space. They did the African American Smithsonian. I mean, they are absolutely the world's best. They are our designers, and we're working with them again. So it's got a hefty price tag. And then there's digitization projects, other programming that we're excited about. So we will be launching a campaign and inviting people. We believe, as I mentioned, that there are people right across the country, given that we're a national institution and our profile is higher, we're hoping that we're going to be able to attract more national donors. And certainly we're right at the very end of a long process with a national foundation, and we should hear within the next month or two a fairly large gift that we're anticipating, which will really begin, we think, this broadening our philanthropic base. But one of the wonderful things about the United States is the desire of many people to be involved in missions that matter and to return from leisure legacy. And we're one of those, and we're so pleased with the number of people who are philanthropic with us. About 45% of our revenues are philanthropy. And we just had our gala 2 weeks ago. We've only had that for 6 years, despite the fact that we're 100 years old. But we did it primarily through a streamed broadcast to homes, and nearly 250 households took that, and it was our most prosperous gala to date. We raised about $550,000, which was a record for us, and so we're thrilled. Even in the midst of all of this, people are still wanting to be supportive. I saw a question, yeah.
I applaud the way you expanded the vision to show us the impact it has today from World War I. But one gap I seem to notice is the lack of the impact of what happened to the Ottoman Empire.
Yes.
And Asia.
Yes.
So you have plans to cover those areas.
That's great. We seek to be comprehensive, but we're not. So, for example, in our collection on the Eastern Front, there are areas which are not complete, and we've got to do better work with that. And that's true also. Part of our initiative around collecting is to ensure that those stories are told. I think that we all have. I sometimes say to groups, we're at a very important moment with people's personal collections, because what was Grandpa's stuff is very soon going to be great-grandpa's shit. And it's going to be dumped out when we're clearing out his house. And so we're at this moment, I think, when there's an opportunity for us to enrich the collection, and if we don't take it, we might find that it's not available again. And it's critical that we preserve those stories from Africa, from Asia, the Eastern Front especially, in order for a more comprehensive story to be told. We're absolutely committed to that and recognize the need for it. Yes?
Considering that you are the #1 tourist attraction in Kansas City, do you plan to have a display or anything significant out at the airport?
That's a good question. So we've begun some elementary conversations about that. You know, what's really interesting is the challenge. We're a very parochial town. I really have to work hard with the city, for example, for them to, I say to them, I've met with them so many times, and visit Kansas City or better, I say, we are, just like you said, the national institution. Milk it for all it's worth. Use us. Now, I heard made a wise thing, but what they tend to do is to talk about us being Liberty Memorial. So even the tram, the light rail, there's going to be a stop just near us in the Fed building. And so we're in an argument at the moment because they want to call that stop Liberty Memorial. We say, what are they looking for? When people are riding that, if they're tourists, what are they looking for? They don't know what Liberty Memorial is. They're looking for the National World War I Museum and Memorial. Now, I recognize that's a long name, but that's what they're looking for. So the challenge for us is to help people to have a more parochial view, have a more expansive view, and see that we have a national treasure here. How can we use it for the economic benefit of the city? And we don't all share the same vision in that respect. In New Orleans, they have the World War II Museum, and it used to be the D-Day Museum. When you go to New Orleans, they've got signs everywhere. National World War I Museum, National World War II Museum, all over the place, because they've realised it's a tourism boom for them. And they've taken all down their signs that say the D-Day Museum, and the city don't know what that means. Anything you can help us to help people shift this orientation. We all know, perhaps in our hearts, that we call it Liberty Memorial, but I tell you, we've got to claim this for the economic benefit of the city, including having some permanent installation at the airport, so that as you do when you're coming into New Orleans, that you're invited to visit the National Museum, because this is the only one in the country. In fact, and we're at the double A to say it's also the National Memorial, so you want to make sure you see that too. Yes, last one. I think we're getting close to time.
Yeah. So you guys have events down there, and I've been to multiple events, and it's a great event venue. So you guys make quite a bit of money from
Yeah.
having events there?
Yeah.
And are you having them currently?
Yeah.
And how do you go about?
Yeah.
Booking
so,
an
you know,
event.
the opening is so much more complicated than closing. As you all know, I knew it was going to be complicated, but oh my goodness, it's so much more complicated because it's so politicized. So many issues around this are politicized. So it's been a fabulous challenge for us to work our way through. We have found that events are very slow to pick up because, like this, people are still figuring out how to do it. And so we've had some. But we are open for business. We just can't have the same occupancy. The city permits 50% occupancy. We're uncomfortable with that. We are more around 20 to 30% occupancy. And so as we figure that out, I think that we'll be more comfortable with larger groups. But we're shopping it. People aren't ready to book yet. That's what we're finding. But we certainly welcome that. We have some wonderful spaces, including some beautiful outdoor spaces as well. In fact, a growing opportunity for us are memorial services, because outdoor memorial services, we've realised during the pandemic and post-pandemic, are sought after. And if one is honouring the life of a veteran, what better place to do that than at the memorial?